The Christmas tree sparkled like a city skyline, but I felt invisible in its glow. I had barely taken my coat off when my mother, Clarissa, glanced at me and said, casually, almost as if reading from a script, "We didn't get you anything this year." The words hung in the living room, like an icicle, dripping slowly onto my heart. I froze, my fingers tightening around the sleeve of my coat. Around me, Blair, my younger sister, laughed with her friends, dangling her phone from a selfie stick as though capturing the perfect holiday narrative. My father, Rowan, glanced away, pretending not to hear, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. I swallowed, reminding myself that this was nothing new. For years, my family had a habit of erasing me during the holidays, folding me into the scenery while they celebrated on their own terms. But this year, something felt different. The sting of being excluded didn't just brush past me. It settled, heavy and persistent, like snow pressing down on the branches outside. And then through the static of disappointment, I saw him, Grandpa Edmund. Grandpa didn't move like everyone else in the room. His presence was deliberate, careful, the kind of quiet authority that didn't shout but demanded notice. He cleared his throat, and the room, still laughing and swapping gift-wrapped selfies, suddenly stilled. His eyes scanned the chaos, catching mine for the briefest moment, a small, unspoken promise that he saw me. I knew that look. It was the same one he gave me years ago when he handed me my first business ledger. When he handed me the keys to the car that my parents had argued about for weeks. He had always been the one who noticed the invisible weight I carried. Grandpa's hand reached behind him and, without a word, pulled forward a box. It was small, rectangular, wrapped in a dull, matte paper, not flashy like Blair's designer bags, or my mother's carefully curated ribbons. But the box had weight. Its presence alone shifted something in the room. For a moment, the air changed, dense, expectant. I didn't move. My mother's smile faltered slightly, as if sensing a scene had been interrupted, a performance about to be rewritten. I took the box from Grandpa with trembling hands. The ribbon was stiff under my fingers, and the paper had a faint scent of cedar, something that reminded me of winter markets and my studio back in Seattle. The room seemed to shrink as I knelt by the tree, the hum of the heater, the murmur of Blair's commentary, even my father's muted discomfort, all fading to a low, irrelevant buzz. I untied the ribbon carefully, almost ritualistically, my mind bracing for another disappointment. Inside was a smaller, wooden box, hand-carved with intricate patterns I didn't recognize at first. It was delicate, deliberate, personal. The kind of gift you couldn't buy on impulse. The kind that suggested thought, presence, and history. My fingers traced the carvings, each swirl and notch, telling a story I wasn't yet ready to hear. Grandpa stood quietly behind me, his eyes patient, unwavering, and then I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in crimson velvet, were stacks of envelopes, each marked in handwriting I knew immediately. His. I didn't understand at first. I thought they might be cards, letters, a series of small, sentimental notes. But as I unfolded the top envelope, I realized each one contained checks, carefully numbered and dated, along with handwritten notes detailing what they were for, my rent, my studio expenses, materials, and even personal gifts he'd set aside over the years. Grandpa had been quietly keeping track of everything I had struggled to afford, everything my mother and sister had treated as invisible, as if my needs were secondary to theirs. My chest tightened as I read the first few notes. "For your winter shipment," one read. "Never worry about supplies again, EE." Another. "For travel to the market, your independence matters, EE." I looked up at him and he nodded gently. "You've always been diligent, Pandora," he said softly. "I've watched you give everything, without asking for acknowledgement. It's time someone honored that. I blinked back tears, the dam breaking slowly. I had spent years letting them drain me emotionally and financially, letting them rewrite my worth as measured by how much I served them. And here he was, quietly reversing the narrative. I could feel my mother's gaze on me, cold, calculated, the kind that tried to reassert dominance without actually speaking. "Grandpa, this isn't necessary," she said, voice light but brittle. "Pandora doesn't need gifts. We've always helped her," she added, as if her generosity excused the years of oversight and dismissal. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't shrink. For the first time, I understood that her generosity had always been conditional, a performance measured by how well I complied. Grandpa shook his head slowly. "What I have here isn't a gift," he said, voice quiet but firm, carrying a weight that silenced the room. "It's recognition of work done, of sacrifices made, of autonomy ignored. And it's time Pandora had control over her own resources." The room shifted, tension pressing down like a heavy curtain. Blair frowned, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or scroll through her phone. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, waiting for a signal from someone else, anyone. And in that pause, I realized that everything in my family's carefully staged Christmas, every laugh, every forced toast, every selective compliment, had been a framework for control. And Grandpa had just removed the scaffolding. I lifted the next envelope, noticing the dates carefully aligned with moments I had barely survived financially. There were notes for emergency repairs on my studio, reimbursements for supplies, even payments covering months when I had skipped meals, so I could afford materials for orders. Each envelope was a quiet testament to the life I had built, unacknowledged, by the family that should have seen it. I felt a strange mix of shame and vindication, shame that I had allowed myself to be invisible for so long, and vindication that someone had been quietly tracking my worth, recognizing it without requiring me to perform. Blair shifted behind me, her phone lowered slightly. I could feel the hesitation in her stance, a momentary crack in the armor of entitlement she always carried. My mother cleared her throat again, attempting to regain control, but the moment had already passed her by. Grandpa's eyes, steady and unwavering, reminded me that the room had already changed. I realized that for the first time in years I wasn't a bystander. I wasn't invisible. The recognition of my efforts had transformed me from someone who merely existed in their shadow to someone whose work, my work, demanded acknowledgement. I set the envelopes aside, opening a small, plain envelope at the bottom of the stack. Inside was a handwritten letter in Grandpa's familiar, looping script. "Pandora," it began, "I've watched you carry this family without complaint, quietly absorbing what should never have been yours to bear. I've stayed silent because I hoped they would notice. But you don't need their recognition anymore. You need your own. These funds are for you to build, grow, and protect what is yours. Never let them decide your worth again." I could feel the weight of his words, heavier than any physical object. For years, I had tolerated dismissals, excuses, and manipulations, telling myself it was temporary, it was family, it was love. But now the truth was glaring. I had been giving, not because I chose to, but because the family had taken it from me. And Grandpa's gift was not just money, it was permission. Permission to stop acquiescing, to reclaim my autonomy, and to refuse their narrative. I looked around, catching my mother's narrowed eyes, the subtle panic in Blair's posture, and even my father's quiet hesitation. And for the first time, I realized that I didn't need to speak loudly to assert my boundaries. The gift itself was proof enough. Grandpa's hand rested on my shoulder. a grounding presence that reminded me of childhood winters spent in his workshop. "They'll try to minimize it," he said quietly. "They'll try to make you feel guilty for accepting what you've earned." I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat. I had already anticipated their reactions: Clarissa's condescending attempts at rationalization, Blair's practiced charm meant to disarm, my father's silent complicity. None of it mattered anymore. For years, my compliance had been their tool. For years, my silence had been interpreted as weakness. But now, armed with knowledge, recognition, and Grandpa's quiet support, I felt an unfamiliar but powerful clarity. I could see every transaction, every subtle theft of my labor, every emotional manipulation laid out in stark detail. It wasn't just about money, it was about respect, dignity, and the simple, radical act of being seen. And as I looked around the room, I noticed the subtle shift. The laughter had died down, the chatter had stilled, and the holiday performances faltered. Grandpa's presence was a silent warning that the rules had changed. My mother attempted to regain control, brushing back a strand of hair as she forced a bright smile. "It's just a Christmas tradition," she said, voice trembling slightly despite the practiced calm. "We usually give together, as a family. Pandora, don't take it personally." I looked at her, really looked, and saw something I hadn't before: fear. Fear that her constructed hierarchy, her system of favoritism, manipulation, and control was finally unraveling. Blair shifted, unconsciously mirroring her mother, as if the script had faltered and neither of them knew the next line. My father cleared his throat, finally speaking. "Maybe we should talk about this later," he said, voice low. But Grandpa cut him off, with a slight shake of his head. "No," he said firmly. "We're talking now. Pandora deserves clarity, honesty, and the respect that has been withheld from her for too long." I felt my chest swell, not with anger, not yet, but with a quiet, fierce recognition that for the first time I was being allowed to occupy space fully, without apology. The letters, the envelopes, the careful tracking of my life were not just gestures. They were evidence, undeniable proof that I had been carrying weight no one else would lift. And now I could finally stand under the weight of my own validation. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold knot of anger and relief intertwine in my chest. For years, I had endured small indignities, being told my work was secondary, being asked to loan money for family projects while my own expenses went ignored, being reminded I was the reliable one, as if reliability meant free labor. Each envelope, each note, each carefully saved check was a revelation, a record that made tangible the abstract frustration and quiet suffering I had felt for so long. Grandpa stood behind me, silent but steady, while my mother and sister fumbled for explanations that didn't exist. Blair's lips parted, and for a moment I thought she might protest, might try to charm or manipulate her way out of the moment. But the truth had weight now. Weight that couldn't be minimized, ignored, or spun. Grandpa's box, his intervention, had shifted the balance of power in a way no argument or tantrum could reverse. And in that shift, I felt a strange, unfamiliar emotion settle. Pride. Not the fleeting pride of success, but the steady, unshakable pride of finally being acknowledged, of finally being allowed to stand as myself in a room that had long denied me that right. I carefully set the last envelope down and finally looked up at my family. The room had gone silent in a way that made every small movement exaggerated. Blair's phone hovered uncertainly in her hand, her lips parted like she was searching for the perfect script. My mother's smile was brittle, sharp edges trying to cover the truth she couldn't deny. And my father, silent, hesitant, as if he had spent his life tiptoeing around her whims, avoided my gaze completely. Grandpa's eyes, steady as ever, held mine, and silently communicated what I had been feeling all along. I was no longer invisible. In that instant, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about Christmas, or gifts, or even money. It was about reclaiming the authority over my own life, something I had never fully grasped until now. For years, I had allowed myself to shrink, to give freely, to assume that family meant sacrifice without recognition. But here, in this room thick with tension, I understood that standing up for yourself isn't betrayal, it's survival. And for the first time in years, I felt the warmth of moral clarity radiating from the core of myself, steady and unwavering. Grandpa finally spoke again, his voice soft but firm. "Pandora, I've been saving this for the right moment," he said, gesturing to the neatly stacked envelopes and letters on the floor. "The moment when it was clear that you were the one carrying the weight quietly, without complaint. That weight belongs to you, not them. This is yours, and it always should have been." My fingers brushed the edges of the envelopes again, and I felt the combined heft of all the years I had given without acknowledgement. The anger simmered now beneath a layer of clarity, transforming into determination. No longer would I allow my work, my labor, or my finances to be hijacked by others' entitlement. No longer would I tolerate the polite dismissals, the "you're always reliable" lines that translated into silent exploitation. Blair's eyes darted to my hands, the letters, the stacks of recorded payments and reimbursements. I knew what she was thinking, that she had underestimated me, that she had taken too much for granted. The thought made me smile faintly, quietly, a smile that wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition, validation, and finally having the authority to protect what was mine. My mother's voice broke the silence again, but it carried the frail edge of panic now. "Pandora, it's just money," she said, voice trembling, despite the effort to sound casual. "We've always shared as a family. You don't need to make a scene." I inhaled slowly, feeling the tension in my chest, and arms begin to coalesce into quiet, unyielding resolve. "It's not just money," I said, voice steady. "It's recognition. It's boundaries. It's my life. I've been responsible, yes, but responsible doesn't mean disposable. I've been generous because I chose to be, not because my work or my resources belong to you." The room went still again. My words weren't loud, but they carried weight, gravity. For the first time, the careful, crafted narratives my mother and sister had built around me faltered under the undeniable truth. My father shifted, uncomfortable but silent, finally recognizing the moment as one where he could not shield or excuse. Blair's phone clattered slightly on the table as she finally lowered it, realizing her commentary, her performance, had no control here. The air felt electric, charged with the quiet force of someone reclaiming their own story. Grandpa leaned slightly on the edge of the table, his hands resting flat. "I've kept records," he said, indicating the letters and envelopes. "Records of everything you've had to cover, every time your labor or your generosity was taken for granted. These documents show the truth, Pandora. They don't lie and they can't be ignored." My pulse quickened as I realized the implications. This wasn't just a personal vindication, it was tangible evidence, a shield against the subtle, insidious manipulations that had defined my life for too long. Blair looked at the stack, her usual poise faltering, and I caught the flicker of doubt in her eyes. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together, attempting to maintain composure, but even she couldn't fully hide it. My father exhaled softly, a sound like resignation, realizing he could no longer mediate or excuse the inequities he had silently allowed. And I sat there steady, aware of the quiet power in simply acknowledging the truth. For the first time, I felt not just seen, but defended, supported, and ready. The room had shifted beneath my feet, without a single shout, a single dramatic gesture. It had shifted with the quiet weight of honesty and deliberate recognition. I opened my laptop then, because knowledge alone isn't enough without action. For years, I had kept spreadsheets and records quietly, tracking my studio expenses, deliveries, and the small, creeping siphoning of funds for family use. Now, with Grandpa's support, I cross-referenced the letters, the checks, and my own meticulously kept ledgers. The numbers rang out with startling clarity. There it was, the proof that I had been quietly financing more than my fair share, that my labor and money had been misdirected, appropriated under the guise of family assistance. I documented everything, line by line, date by date. Every transfer, every misdirected payment, every resource taken without consent, all clearly visible. The realization didn't crush me, it galvanized me. I wasn't powerless anymore. I wasn't the passive, compliant child my family had cast me as. I was Pandora, business owner, meticulous planner, self-reliant. And now, for the first time in years, I was fully aware that the line between generosity and exploitation had been crossed, and that I had the power to assert boundaries, reclaim my resources, and redefine what family loyalty truly meant. Grandpa's quiet nod from across the room confirmed it. I was ready. The tension in the room was palpable as I closed my laptop, the screen casting a pale glow over my determined expression. Grandpa's presence beside me was a steadying anchor. My mother, Clarissa, shifted in her chair, as if every instinct told her to argue, but the evidence, meticulously documented, undeniable, had robbed her of the usual leverage. Blair twirled a strand of hair nervously, her phone forgotten on the table. For the first time, she seemed human rather than performing for an audience, caught between entitlement and the stark reality she had been shielded from. I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, not the kind that seeks revenge, but the kind that honors the truth. I've spent years giving, supporting, and covering for this family. I began, my voice steady, carrying across the room like a bell, cutting through fog. But I will no longer allow my resources, my labor, or my autonomy to be treated as communal property. I am done apologizing for being reliable. I am done hiding. And I will not let anyone misrepresent my worth again. My mother opened her mouth, but no words came. Grandpa's hand on my shoulder was gentle, reassuring, a silent permission to speak my truth fully. I stood, placing my palms flat against the wooden table, feeling the grain beneath my fingers as a grounding force. Each envelope, each check, each note had been a small act of defiance, carefully built over time, a ledger of honesty against a backdrop of family manipulation. I met my mother's eyes directly, unflinching, and for the first time I saw her uncertainty crack through the practiced smile. Blair's posture stiffened, her phone abandoned, her performance disrupted. My father shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing the weight of silence he had maintained for years. "This isn't about money," I continued, voice measured, deliberate. "It's about respect, boundaries, and recognition of my work. For too long, I've allowed my labor, my income, and my efforts to be redirected to serve family interests without acknowledgement. That stops today. Every dollar, every resource, every favor I've provided without consent will be documented and returned if necessary. And I will ensure my independence is respected, moving forward." The room was quiet, tension hanging like frosted air. Every word settling like snow on the furniture. Grandpa's eyes softened, but remained firm, communicating what no one else could, that I had the right to claim my life. My mother's voice finally cracked, sharp with panic. "Pandora, this is ridiculous. We've done so much for you. Gifts, opportunities, everything," she exclaimed, her hands waving like she could physically sweep away the evidence before her. I shook my head slowly, the clarity within me solidifying with each breath. Opportunities? Or obligations? That I've had to shoulder alone while my generosity was treated as default labor? I've never asked for this, I said, gesturing toward the envelopes, the letters, the carefully maintained ledger. I'm not attacking anyone. I'm asserting my life, my boundaries, my work. This is about reclaiming what is mine, something you and Blair have long treated as communal. It's not about punishment, it's about recognition. Blair's jaw tightened, and I noticed the subtle tremor in her hands. She had never seen me this resolved. My mother's shoulders slumped slightly, the armor of entitlement beginning to crack under the weight of undeniable truth. And in that moment, the room, so carefully choreographed for decades around control, appearances, and selective generosity, had no script left to follow. I had rewritten it, quietly but irrevocably. Grandpa leaned forward, clearing his throat, and the room obeyed the stillness he demanded. Pandora has maintained every record, every payment, and every contribution over the years. What she presents here is a reflection of her integrity, her diligence, and the labor she has quietly carried while others assumed it was endless. That is not exaggeration, that is fact. It cannot be disputed. His words landed in the room with gravity, heavy and precise, like the final stroke of a judge's gavel. My mother shifted in her seat, opening her mouth to protest, but she faltered under the weight of undeniable reality. Blair's phone was completely forgotten now, a silent witness to her own privilege being challenged. I felt a quiet, simmering pride, not born of malice, but born of truth. For the first time in years, I could feel myself occupying space fully, without compromise, without apology, without the constant, exhausting performance of compliance. The letters and envelopes weren't just evidence. They were liberation, tangible proof that my life, my work, and my independence were mine to protect. Grandpa's eyes flicked to me, steady and warm, silently affirming that I had the right to finally claim what I had always earned. I took a deep breath, the scent of cedar and paper filling my lungs, grounding me. "Grandpa, with your permission," I said, voice firm, "I will maintain these records and ensure that my work and resources are protected. I will continue to support the family where I choose, not where it is demanded." Grandpa's lips curved into a faint, approving smile. "That is exactly right," he said. "You decide what you give, Pandora. No one else. That is your right." My mother's face hardened, and she shot a look at my father, as if he could intervene and erase the moment. But he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor, finally conceding that the years of silent complicity had ended. Blair's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then subtly to grudging respect, though unspoken. I felt a small flicker of satisfaction, a quiet acknowledgement that this confrontation, though uncomfortable for them, was necessary. For the first time, I wasn't simply surviving within my family. I was thriving in the reclamation of my autonomy, empowered by clarity, evidence, and Grandpa's unwavering support. And in the glow of the Christmas tree, the room seemed smaller, contained and honest, as if truth had compressed the chaos into a single, undeniable reality. The room seemed to hold its breath as I stood, slowly gathering the envelopes and letters into my arms. The Christmas tree twinkled behind me, indifferent to the drama unfolding, its lights reflecting off the polished ornaments like tiny, impartial witnesses. Blair's eyes followed every movement, wide and uncertain, no longer masked by her usual confident grin. My mother's posture slumped, her carefully maintained performance crumbling under the undeniable truth laid bare on Grandpa's table. My father, quiet as ever, shifted in his chair, realizing for the first time that silence had allowed harm to persist. Grandpa's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, a reminder that support didn't always have to be loud or public. It simply needed to exist. I felt a strange calm, almost meditative, as I lifted the box and stepped toward the hallway. Every step felt deliberate, each movement a declaration. My life, my resources, my boundaries were mine to guard. The tension was heavy, yet beneath it, I felt the steady pulse of justice. Quiet, but resolute. This wasn't vengeance. This was reclamation. I placed the letters and envelopes carefully in a safe corner of my studio, near my ledger and business files, a place I could always see them. It wasn't about flaunting what I had reclaimed. It was about creating a visible boundary, a permanent record that my efforts, my labor, and my resources could not be taken without consent. For the first time, I felt entirely in control of my life. Grandpa followed behind me, his steps slow but steady, offering the occasional soft comment about the arrangement of shelves or the stacking of boxes, mundane yet grounding. He never once attempted to speak for me, to redirect the narrative. He simply offered support, allowing me to reclaim my authority. I realized that for years I had waited for permission to assert myself, for validation that I was entitled to boundaries and respect. And now I understood that permission had always been within me. Grandpa's intervention was a catalyst, a shield, a quiet but undeniable endorsement of my right to stand fully in my life. In the quiet of my studio, surrounded by paint, pine, and the faint scent of cedar from the letters, I felt something shift. The oppressive weight of obligation lifted, replaced by a calm, resolute energy. The days following Christmas were quiet, almost eerily so, as the family adjusted to the reality of what had happened. Clarissa sent terse, sugar-coated messages, polite but distant, attempting to maintain appearances without truly engaging. Blair appeared once, hesitantly, carrying a small tray of pastries. She placed them silently on my workbench and muttered a soft, almost embarrassed, "For your studio." No camera, no audience, no performance, just a simple acknowledgement. My father called occasionally, quiet check-ins, each one hesitant but respectful of the boundaries I had firmly established. And Grandpa, as always, remained a steadfast presence, visiting with a thermos of tea or helping me measure wood for new shelves, his calm guidance grounding me in ways words never could. Each day, the quiet empowerment I felt grew stronger. I began to notice things I had long ignored: the freedom to organize my space without interference, the ability to choose my hours, and the profound relief of knowing that my efforts would be directed toward my goals alone, not siphoned off to prop up others' narratives. The studio became more than a workspace. It was a sanctuary, a testament to my labor, my independence, and the truth I had finally claimed. The following Christmas, I decorated the studio with the ornaments I had made that year, each one a small, shining testament to my independence. I thought back to the previous Christmas, to the sting of being told I had no gifts, and the quiet intervention of Grandpa that had altered the trajectory of my life. I realized that boundaries, once asserted, were liberating. They didn't isolate, they defined. They allowed relationships to exist on terms of mutual respect rather than obligation or performance. That year, I invited only a few close friends, people who had supported me and never questioned my worth. The tree in my studio glimmered, and I felt a deep sense of peace. I no longer needed validation from my mother, my sister, or even my father. Recognition had come from the person who mattered most, the person who had always seen me, and more importantly, from myself. Grandpa's presence, even in quiet moments, reminded me that acknowledgement without performance was real and sustaining. For the first time, Christmas felt like mine, not a day of performance or expectation, but a day of truth, gratitude, and quiet, self-earned joy. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall softly over Seattle, the flakes like tiny crystals dancing in the streetlights. The ornaments on my workbench caught the light, reflecting back a life I had fought to claim. Grandpa's voice echoed softly in my memory. You only need to speak the truth. Fear has no power over honesty. I had spent years in the shadow of my family's expectations, performing, giving, and shrinking to fit the roles they demanded. But now, in the quiet glow of my studio, I understood something vital. Freedom wasn't about escape. It was about boundaries. It was about knowing your worth, claiming it, and refusing to let others define it. I poured myself a cup of tea, the warmth seeping through my fingers, and felt a steady, profound contentment. This was Christmas. This was recognition. This was life. On my own terms. My family had underestimated me for decades, but now they had no choice but to acknowledge it. And for the first time in my life, I smiled fully, freely, and without apology. Because I was seen, I was validated, and I had finally learned that my boundaries were the doors to my own peace.